Okay,
Yeah.
do after.
I don't mind which way round we do it.
Okay, so welcome to this, the third webinar in the series. This one is about observation. Yesterday we looked at questionnaires. The day before that we looked at interviews, and we've recorded those, or at least we've recorded the first one. We'll give you the link to that shortly. We're going to look at observations today. So I'm going to start by talking a little bit about observations as a data collection method. We'll have a look at some examples, and then we'll have a look at some of the tools that we can use as well. A lot to cover here. So I want to start by getting you to think about what kind of purpose. Why do we do observations? We've talked about collecting data through interviews and by using questionnaires. What about observations? Well, in a sense, some people argue that observation is perhaps the most naturalistic of all the data collection methods because it's live. You're not relying on a mediated form of data as you are with interviews, and certainly with questionnaires. People are having to do something before you get the data. They're having to be recorded or they're having to complete a survey. With observations, you're there personally, in most cases anyway, and therefore you're seeing things as they happen. It's a naturalistic setting, particularly if it's taking place in a classroom. And obviously this gives you a chance to check what people tell you. So another advantage is often the fact that people may tell you one thing, but you can actually see in an observation whether it's true. So they might say, for example, I'm the kind of teacher who likes to teach by encouraging discussion. And you can have a look in an observation and see if that's true. It's also an opportunity for you to look at your own practice, if you get a chance to observe your own practice, and to see it in ways that you might not normally see if you're a teacher at the front of the classroom. We often talk about making the familiar strange, and that's what we're trying to do here. We're trying to step back a little bit and watch what's going on through a different set of eyes or a different perspective. And the final thing I think about observations in terms of purpose is that they're very context sensitive. So, for example, when you do an interview, the interview is a little bit false in the sense you're taking somebody out of their natural setting and you're recording their voice, but we don't get very much sense of what context it is they're working in other than what they say. With an observation, of course, it's very rich in terms of context. You can see everything, and particularly if you're using technology like a camera or an audio device, you get a real sense of being there in the moment. And I guess the final thing, of course, is that an interview, particularly if it's just recorded, and especially an online survey, you get no sense of what people are doing other than speaking or writing. And observations show you all the non-verbal behaviours as well, which often can be just as telling as the written ones.
They can, but of course that brings it some inherent problems because you need to think about this when it comes to analysis, because you're not just now analysing the word, you're analysing the contextual information as well. So when you're planning your observation, you need to be thinking about exactly what it is you will be observing, and I expect you'll come on to that.
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm just going to move now to thinking about the types of data we collect. And actually what struck me was how similar this is actually to what Sarah was talking about yesterday. Sarah listed types of data that we collect in questionnaires. And there's a similarity here because I think the first type of data you collect in observations, or you can collect, are facts. So you can collect things like how many students are there in a classroom, how many students went to the toilet, if for any reason you want to investigate that. Yeah, how many students ask questions. That's very factual. It's something you observe. The second thing is events. You can have a look for things like the interaction between the students and the teacher. That's an event. Or you could, for example, check how many students are on task and doing what the teacher's asked, or off task. So that's an event. And the third thing, which is perhaps the most interesting and the most complex, is you can look at behaviours. So, for example, you can have a look at, is the teacher a friendly teacher? Are the students behaving well? Are the students aggressive? And there's a whole range of interactions and behaviours that you can look for in an observation. That would be almost impossible to get in an interview or in a survey.
And this is what we were talking about earlier, that actually now what you're thinking about in terms of your analysis are perhaps your own value judgments that you might put on top of this.
Yeah, absolutely. So let's think now about some of the problems. Before we look at the advantages, I just want to make you aware of some of the issues or problems associated with observations. And sometimes, despite what I said at the start, which is observations are very naturalistic, that doesn't mean they are not unproblematic. They come with problems or issues just like any other methodology. I think the first one is probably what counts as evidence when you're undertaking an observation. Because although it sounds as if we are there, we're in the scene, so we must capture everything, of course we don't. As human beings, we can only look one way. We don't see what's happening behind us. We don't know how many people are observing. So is it one person, two people? How many views are you taking into account for? When are you looking? So for example, you might be looking at something and at that point you see some action, but if you'd done it 10 minutes earlier or later, completely different scene. So there's a question about what counts as evidence. There's also the issue that's referred to as reactivity. And that's the issue of, will the participants behave naturally, whatever that means, when you're there watching them? So for example, we know that when students are being observed and an inspector arrives, often their behaviors change, either for good or for bad. And so you've got this problem that when you are part of the dynamics, the classroom environment, you may change the way in which your participants behave. There's also what we call attention deficit, which is really to do with you as the observer. How long can you concentrate? For example, a lesson might last 60 minutes, but can you concentrate and focus all the time for 60 minutes? It's very easy to miss something if your attention wanders. There is also an issue, I think, about interpretation. So a lot of the time when we're undertaking observation, we observe certain things and we use them as proxies. So for example, we might be measuring the amount of time that students are on a task. So we watch and we look. And what we're really thinking about there, we're using that as a proxy for engagement. And so we translate that into engagement. But in fact, how can we ever be certain? Just because somebody's involved in a task, are they engaged? So there's a risk that we can make judgments about what's going on when we observe that actually isn't necessarily true. A good example of that might be you're observing in a library and you want to have a look at the quality of the resources. So you find a book which is torn and tattered. Now, how do you interpret that? You could interpret that as being an example that these books get very well read because it's torn and tattered. Alternatively, somebody else could look at it and say, this must be a school full of vandalism because the students don't look after and respect the books. So there's a lot of interpretation and we ought to be aware of that.
Yeah, and I think this comes back again to the value set that you have and being aware of what your value judgments are and what you're bringing to it, bringing to the analysis yourself. And again, it has overlaps of what we were talking about yesterday in terms of that notion of bias and your position within the research.
Yeah, okay. So we're going to move on now to think about how we do it in terms of observations. And one way to think about observations, which I think is true as well of interviews, is we can think of it in terms of how structured the observation is. And so we can talk about highly structured observations and we can talk about unstructured observations, and probably somewhere in the middle is semi-structured. So if we start with highly structured, a highly structured observation is where you've probably already worked out what you're going to be looking for before you go into the classroom. So generally speaking, there might be a hypothesis behind this. So let's take an example. Let's imagine you've done some reading about girls and boys' behavior in class, and the literature tells you that girls spend more time on task than boys. You might decide that you're going to go in to observe this phenomena and you're going to collect data to decide whether it's true or whether it's false. That would be a highly structured observation because you'd have some kind of format, some kind of template which you'd already devised to record that data. And in fact, I'm just going to show you now an example of a highly structured when I find it, a highly structured observation. Yeah, I'll need to share the screen. So If we just go back to sharing screen. Okay. It's that one, yeah. Okay, in fact, you're looking at the opposite here, you're looking at the unstructured, so let's go back. There we are. There's a structured observation. This isn't about boys and girls. This is actually looking at the kind of teacher. It's looking at what teachers do. But you can see that it's highly structured. Down the side, you've already determined the features that you're looking for, like the amount of discussion, the amount of times the teacher is talking, the amount of times the teacher is asking questions. And across the top, you've got the frequency. So this is an example of a very structured observation where you've already determined, probably based on reading, you've determined the kind of things you're looking for. So that's one extreme. At the other extreme, we've got what we might call the unstructured, completely unstructured, where you would basically go into a lesson, it might be a classroom, with no preconceptions. You're not predicting everything. You're just watching and you're just waiting to see what happens. And again, I think this example, we've got a screenshot here of an unstructured. So this is an unstructured observation pro forma. And you can see that what the observer has done here is simply put the time down and then describe what's going on. So the observer, would have started with an entirely blank screen and just built it up as we go along. And somewhere in the middle is probably a kind of semi-structured method where you start with something, but you don't stick with it for very long. So those are our different approaches to organizing an actual observation. I'm just going to stop sharing the screen for a second and think about the issues associated with both, because what you need to be aware of is for every form of observation, there is a price to pay, if you like. For example, the highly structured interview is going to take you a long time, probably, to design. You're going to have to think very carefully about what you want to look at, and then you're going to have to design a sheet to capture that information. However, although it takes a long time to design, it will actually be relatively quick to analyze. You'll probably be able to do a number count. You'll be able to check the columns where you've ticked the boxes or whatever, and it should be quick. The opposite is true of an unstructured interview. An unstructured interview will take hardly any time to prepare. You basically need to get a clipboard and a pen. You go into the lesson and watch. But it will take a long time to analyze, because the chances are most of the data you collect is going to be open text. And that's going to take much longer to analyze than tick boxes or numbers. So there's a price to pay.
Yeah. You said in unstructured interviews, you meant observations.
Oh, sorry, yes, I did make unstructured observations. Yeah, okay. So that brings us on to the role of the observer. What are you doing as an observer? Something to be aware of. And again, as in all these things, there's a range of different possibilities. One opportunity, one possibility is you could be what's called a complete participant. That's almost what you normally do. If you're a classroom teacher, you could say, well, that's what I am. I'm a participant in the action. I'm a teacher. And you might make some notes after the lesson. At the end of the lesson, you might decide, I'm going to try and recollect what it was that happened during the lesson and make some notes. That would be a very low-key, naturalistic, unstructured form of observation.
But hopefully most of you can see what the pitfalls of that is. It requires you to recall exactly what happened during the lesson, and that's often not possible. It requires you to have the time after the lesson to actually go in and write down your reflections.
Yeah, exactly. And the next form, which is slightly more structured, might be participant as observer. So in this role, you are still the participants. You're still the teacher, for example, but you maybe have some form of data recorder with you. You might have a clipboard. You might have a recorder. You might just have a notebook. And every now and then you go back to your desk, for example, and make some notes based on what you've observed. In other words, your essential role is one of a participant, in this case, a teacher, but you are also making notes as an observer. And then, of course, you can flip that on its head, and you could be an observer who is a participant as well. So here, I'd imagine this is where you might go and observe another teacher. Your main role is to observe, and so you might be taking notes or using a pro forma, but occasionally you might join in. A group or a child might ask for help, and so you'd go and join the action. So that's slightly different, but it's kind of a variation on the first one. And then the final form of observation, the final role, is the role that we call complete observer, where you make no effort to be part of the classroom. This is kind of typified, I guess, by inspectors who come to visit. Sometimes we use the analogy of a one-way mirror. You're probably aware of a one-way mirror where you can see the action, but they can't see you. So in this role, you're kind of divorced from what's going on. You try to remain entirely neutral. You try to remain outside of what's going on and simply observe it.
Yeah.
So those are the different roles, and they can be measured, as I said earlier, on a continuum from being highly structured to being very unstructured. And it's up to you to decide which of these roles you think will be most appropriate for the research you want to undertake. Do you want to step back from the action? Are you going to have a kind of checklist? Is that a checklist you've already developed? Incidentally, there are many available off the shelf, and we'll make some links to some of these. We've already done that in the Google Classroom. So you don't have to invent them all yourself, but you can if you wish to. Or are you just going to literally go in and see what happens and then make sense of it afterwards? That's a decision to think about before you start, obviously.
And obviously some of that decision making is going to come down to what your research question is, what your purpose for carrying out the research is.
Yeah.
And that will help you to determine not just your data collection tool, whether it's the questionnaires, the interviews, or this observation, but also the way in which you're going to carry that out.
Yeah, absolutely. As I think this is the point we've probably been making in all these webinars, that so much of the decision making rests on what you want to find out, which is usually dictated by the research question. So your research question will probably tell you a lot about, first of all, which method you choose, or methods, might be more than one. And secondly, which variation of method. Is it, for example, a structured interview, or is it a very unstructured interview, or is it something in between? And what's your role?
It is, and I know we spent a lot of time when we were actually with you face to face talking about the research question, but I'm hoping that by now you're beginning to see why it is such a central element, because absolutely everything hinges on getting that correct.
Yeah, okay. Now, what I'd like to finish by looking at, the last thing we'd like to talk about is how today we can use technology to support us in classroom observations, or indeed any form of observation. Most likely it will be classrooms. And we're going to look at two particular approaches. These are both using apps. And what I'd like you to think about while we're doing this is, what form of observation does this lend itself to? Is it structured? Is it unstructured? Would you be a participant? Would you be an outsider, a kind of complete observer? Where do you think you would fit on those continua that we talked about earlier? So I'm going to start by looking at something called VO, and I'm going to share the screen with you again. And when we share the screen, we'll see, yeah, let's just move that out of the way. We'll see VO in all its glory. So let's just say we're going to share. Which screen are we going to share?
That one.
That one.
Isn't that one?
I think it might be.
I think it is.
Okay, let's share that one. Okay, so hopefully you're now looking at
the green lines around it.
Yeah, so let me just make that a little bit bigger. I'm a little bit wary about making this full screen. But this is VO. It's an app which sits on a mobile device like a tablet or a phone. And I believe it works on both an Android and an iOS device. We will check that. And I'm going to just show you a short video which explains basically how it works and what it is.
Once you've saved your video, you can view them in the review section.
Sorry, we are watching the wrong video, so let me just go back and
at the beginning.
And we'll start at the beginning, shall we? Where we're supposed to be, which is
that's the login. That one.
let's go back to the classroom, because in the classroom, what I've done is to post for you a series of screenshots, and this is the screenshot I really wanted. So let's go to this one.
Using the email address and password that you created when you set up your VO account, start the app and log into VO. Then press record, select the appropriate tag set, and continue. Enter a title for the video and a simple description, and then fill in the fields in the pre-record form. These help you search for particular fields at a later stage. You could, for example, search for videos with a particular class or with a particular year group based on the information in the pre-record form. Then press record and start recording the lesson. And as you identify characteristics of good teaching, press the top level tag and select the appropriate sub-tag. When pressing the top level tag, the video is time-stamped 5 seconds before you press the button. Try to tag key moments rather than absolutely everything that occurs during the lesson. You can also track where the focus is during the lesson, so either on the teacher, pupils working by themselves, or in a group, or as a whole class. You can also track the level of engagement by swiping the slider at the bottom to the left and to the right. At the end of the lesson, you can press the stop button and you'll be prompted to save the video. Fill in the post-record information form. Again, this can be edited according to your needs. At the bottom of the form, press continue, and the video is now saved in the review section of the app.
Okay, now I'm going to stop the sharing just for a second. What you saw there was a very quick introduction as to how to use VO. So VO is an app which is designed to be used to record with video and sound classroom observations. So you carry the app around, obviously on your mobile device. As you can see, you predetermine some of the things you think you're going to watch. So it's actually quite structured, because as you saw in that example, there were some tags that had been preloaded into the app, and you can make these up yourself. You can change the tabs. So for example, in this case, we were looking at the amount of questions a teacher might be asking, who's asking the questions, how long is the question being asked for, and so on. And every time you see an activity, you simply press the tag, the button, and it records that tag against the piece of video that you're filming. And that enables you, after you've done the lesson observation, to go back and watch the video again, but to watch it based on the codes or the tags that you used during the filming. So used in that way, VO is quite a structured form of observation, I think.
It's as structured as the number of tags that you put in. So you can make it more structured or less structured depending on the tags that you put in there to begin with.
Exactly.
The other thing to say about it is that within the VO software, there is also an analysis section, so that you can, I think, are we going to watch it?
Yeah,
oh, I'm stealing his thunder.
It's all right.
We're going to watch it.
Well, yes, we are. It was a good lead into it, Ray. We haven't actually talked about analysis in any of the other webinars, because we will be doing more work on how you analyze your data.
When we come to Kalmar.
When we come to Kalmar in the spring, in March. But I'm going to show you this one. It's only a short 2 minutes, because otherwise you may not appreciate what this particular app does. Because you might say, well, I could record my class just using an iPad. What's different about VO? So let's just watch the analysis section, and then I think you'll get an idea of why it may be worth investing some time in using this. So if we can just come back to the screen, share the screen. So this one now is looking at, didn't mean to do that. This one's looking at the analysis side of it.
Here you'll see all of the videos that you've recorded, and by pressing on the video, it takes you through to the timeline of events that you recorded, and simply by pressing on the appropriate subtag, you can jump to that moment and play it back and hear what was being said at the time. You can make notes, and as soon as you added a note, you can see that the notepad has turned red for that particular tag to identify that there's been something written here. We can also click on folders to group the tags. This shows the greens for positives, amber for questions, and red for areas for development. Clicking on Info simply gives you the pre-record and the post-record data. While clicking on the statistics, it'll show the focus, giving a breakdown of the focus on the teacher, pupils working independently, and pupils working as a group or as a whole class. The graph shows a representation of areas of strength and for development, and the engagement curve shows where engagement changed during the lesson, identifying key moments in time where you might like to go back and reflect on why engagement increased or decreased. Uploading a video to your secure online portal is very easy. Simply press the Upload to Cloud button on the right. It'll confirm that you want to upload this. Say yes, and the upload will begin, providing you're connected to a Wi-Fi network. On average, it takes about 1 to 2 minutes to upload an hour's worth of video. Once the video has been uploaded to the portal, you can delete the video from the iPad, saving some memory space. Don't forget, if you're sharing the iPad, you need to log out now and encourage the next person to make sure that they log in to their account.
Okay, so that gives you an idea why Veo as an app adds additional value compared to just using your camera to record the session. It enables you to go back afterwards and to analyze the data according to the tags that you preloaded. And as Sarah said, although that was a very structured example with lots of tags and lots of different codes, you could set up a very simple example. You could have almost no codes, although you might then ask, what am I going to do? You could actually code as you go along if you wanted to, or you could have a very, very simple structure. So it lends itself to different forms of observation. And it's a tool that enables you to collect data without having to make notes. Because if you're not going to use video or audio, the assumption is you're going to be making observation notes in one form or another. And you might decide that's too difficult or too distracting. So that's where I think technology has a part to play.
Yeah, and it's not so much in the recording of the data that it becomes more of an issue. It's more of an issue in the analysis, because if you've taken notes and they're handwritten, you're going to have lots and lots and lots of notes to read through. And if you're going to use a data analysis software, all of that will have to be typed into some form of document which can be imported to the analysis software. So it's kind of thinking about the tool, which you need to almost think about how might you think about analysing it as well.
Yeah. Okay. Now the last piece of software, we'll just look very quickly.
Can I just add one other thing about Veo? Is are you going to talk about costs at all?
No. That's fine.
So Veo, you have to pay for it. However, you get 5 free attempts at it, I think, first, don't you? You can record 5 videos before you then have to start paying for it. And obviously with the free versions there is some limitations in the functionality that you have, but that's just for you to think about the cost implications of things like this. Okay, so the last thing we'll look at is an app called Lesson Note, and I think we'll share the screen, we'll be able to see it. So Lesson Note, you should be looking at a screen now with a few examples. Lesson Note is a free app that allows you to plot the different positions and the interactions of students and teachers dynamically on a mobile device. So it comes with a number of templates. You can change these. You can change them according to the classroom configuration you have. So in these examples, students are sat in small groups. And it allows you to annotate, for example, where did the teacher move to? Or who did the teacher ask questions of? You can simply
tap the student and it will make a recording of the fact that the teacher asked a question of that student. So it's a way of recording dynamics, things like who spoke, how often they did speak, who asked questions, was it the teacher, was it the student?
And more importantly, who isn't asking questions?
Yeah, exactly. And you can interact with this, you can make your own tags and notes. It's quite a sophisticated piece of software, although again, it can be used at a very simple level. So this is a kind of structured, semi-structured form of observation. And if you're interested in the classroom dynamics, how students are reacting, where they're sat, whether their seating plan makes any difference, this might be a useful way of recording that, in which case you should have a look at this app. Incidentally, while we're on this website, and we'll put the links in the Google Classroom, there is an organization in the USA which is called Study. I'll just click on their website, and whoops, I meant to go to their home page. And this is it's called the Lesson Study Alliance. And they focus on the value of studying lessons and sharing those lessons with colleagues. And you might be interested in that as a resource as well, because they promote the use of Lesson Notes as an app.
Am I right in thinking that Lesson Note is just for Apple devices, or can it be used on Android as well?
Good question. I'm not sure of the answer. I should have prepared that. We'll try and find out and write that down. It certainly works on Apple devices. Yeah. So that's about it in terms of observations. We've covered, I think, the principles. First of all, the value. We've looked at how you might observe and why you might observe. We've looked at some of the problems associated. And we've then looked at how technology could be used if you decide you want to do an observation, either as part of your methodology or your entire methodology. Depends what the question might be. Now, the only thing we haven't talked about here are some of the ethical issues associated with observations, and indeed ethical issues associated with all forms of data collection. So we'll do that separately. We're going to have it will be a shorter webinar that we'll produce, looking at what we refer to as ethical issues that you need to be aware of when you're undertaking any form of data collection or research. Okay, thank you very much for watching. That was it. Stop video. I thought you would have. I'm still recording.